Since winning the Hasselblad Masters in 2021, I've photographed all of my personal projects with Hasselblad cameras, from the X2D and X2D Mark II to the 907X. That journey completely changed the way I think about cameras. It stopped being about the latest specs. Instead, I became fascinated by cameras that make the process of photography more enjoyable. Beautiful design, exceptional craftsmanship, thoughtful typography, and a philosophy that puts all of its focus on what really matters: making the next photograph instead of just taking it. Once you start looking at cameras this way, it's almost impossible to ignore one other iconic premium camera brand. Whether it was scrolling through the videos of Dave Herring, Mike Chudley, or Alan Schaller, Leica kept appearing on my YouTube feed. And I have to admit, I was hooked. After years of watching videos, reading reviews, and wondering what it would feel like to own a Leica myself, 4 months ago I finally had the opportunity to trade one of my cameras for a Leica M11-P. Since then, it has become my camera for all family trips and everyday carry. So, let's find out what happens when a long-time Hasselblad photographer starts living with a Leica, and why the M11-P wasn't quite the experience I expected. Yeah, we all know the theory. Rangefinder patch, frame lines, manual focus. I thought I knew exactly what I was getting myself into. And honestly, the rangefinder was the biggest reason I had always wanted a Leica M. I love manual focus, and I use it every single day with my shift lenses and technical cameras anyway. In my opinion, the Leica rangefinder is the most elegant implementation of manual focus ever made. The lenses have hard stops at both minimum focus distance and infinity. And thanks to the focus tab, I can always tell roughly where my focus is without taking my eye away from the viewfinder. My Hasselblad V lenses also feel great to focus manually thanks to their focus clutch, even though they only have soft stops at their end. But I really miss that little focus tab underneath the lens that instantly tells my fingers exactly where the focus is. When I'm watching my kids play through the optical viewfinder of the M11-P, there are few things that feel more direct than lining up the images in the rangefinder patch and pulling focus myself. No autofocus algorithm decides what should be sharp. That's entirely up to me and my experience with the camera. And honestly, that's an incredible feeling. But as wonderful as that experience is, there's also a downside that I'm still struggling with. If my Hasselblad cameras stand for absolute precision, the Leica M represents almost the exact opposite. As an architectural photographer, I'm obsessive about composition. A diagonal that starts exactly in the corner of the frame. A roofline ending just a few millimeters below the edge of the image. With the Leica M, all of that becomes educated guesswork. At 35mm, I already have to press my eye tightly against the viewfinder just to see the frame lines. And even then, the framing changes slightly depending on the angle of my eye. At 75mm, I'm composing inside a tiny little box. That inevitably leads to framing errors that drive me absolutely crazy up to this date. Then there's another challenge at closer distances: viewfinder parallax. Because I'm not looking through the lens itself, but through a separate optical viewfinder that's positioned above and to the left of it, my final composition shifts noticeably. I often use leaves, drinking glasses, or other foreground elements to add depth and naturally frame my children while playing. Only after taking the picture do I realize that although I could clearly see my son through the rangefinder, he's completely hidden behind the foreground object in the final image. At that point, the decisive moment is already gone. The same thing happens with more distant subjects. For example, I might carefully position the sun right along the edge of a building to create a beautiful lens flare. only to discover that the sun isn't visible through the lens at all. At first, these little flaws were genuinely frustrating, especially coming from Hasselblad, where what you see is exactly what you get. But over time, I've started seeing these limitations differently. Instead of fighting them, I'm trying to embrace them now. The Leica M11-P encourages me to photograph more freely. It reminds me that photography isn't always about perfect framing. Sometimes it's about letting go, being present, and getting completely immersed in the moment unfolding in front of the lens. If only that had been my biggest surprise. When I first started researching Leica, I kept hearing people talk about the unpredictable auto-white balance. Many photographers recommended setting it manually. Honestly, I thought people were exaggerating a bit. Then I picked up the camera. From day one, I noticed the exact same thing. Many of my images come out noticeably cooler than the scene actually looked. Coming from Hasselblad, arguably the most natural color science I've ever used, that was a bigger adjustment than I expected. Instead of simply enjoying my photos, I now have to correct almost every single one before I'm happy with it. And unfortunately, it doesn't stop there. Exposure has been another surprise. And no, I'm not talking about the first 5 photos I accidentally took with the lens cap still on, because it's a rangefinder and I don't see what the lens sees. I was genuinely excited about Leica's highlight-weighted metering. On paper, it sounds brilliant. Never a blown highlight again. In reality though, about 90% of my images ended up 2 or 3 stops underexposed. There was always a lamp, the sun, or some bright reflection somewhere in the frame that the camera desperately wanted to protect. Switching to center-weighted metering made a noticeable difference. But I still find myself correcting exposure far more often than I ever did with my Hasselblad cameras. And normally that wouldn't bother me too much, except I can't really fix those images on the go anymore inside the Leica Photos app. And this is where Hasselblad has completely spoiled me. I've made several videos on this channel about Focus Mobile. From remotely controlling the camera, to importing images, to editing RAW files, it offers pretty much everything I need for my personal photography. With the Leica Photos app on Android, I can't edit my images at all. On iOS, I can apply some of the Leica looks, but I still can't make basic RAW adjustments like exposure or white balance. So whenever an image is too dark, I have to send it over to Lightroom Mobile before I can share it with my family. It's just a surprisingly clumsy workflow for something I do after almost every outing. And as we are talking about file management, with my Hasselblad cameras, I never use memory cards and instead work directly from the built-in 1 TB SSD. Naturally, I wanted to continue exactly the same workflow with the Leica M11-P and its built-in 256 GB of storage. But my Mac doesn't recognize the camera as a drive. Neither Lightroom nor Capture One can see it. The only application that recognizes the internal storage is Apple's image capture utility. And honestly, that's painfully slow. While we're talking about USB, charging has also been surprisingly inconsistent. With my Hasselblad cameras, I plug in a USB-C cable and walk away. That's it. With Leica, charging the camera while it's powered off simply doesn't work reliably. According to Leica forums, the solution is to connect the cable, turn the camera on, open the menu, check the tiny LED on the bottom plate to make sure it's actually charging, and preferably leaving the camera powered on during that process. Sometimes that works. Other times, I grab the camera the next morning only to discover the battery is still sitting at 20%. For a camera at this price point, that's honestly not an experience I expected. But it's definitely not all that bad. In fact, the Leica M11-P, if charged, has the best battery life of any camera I've ever used. Of course, no autofocus, no IBIS. The rear screen stays off by default. I can easily use it for an entire week of family outings without even thinking about charging it. That simplicity completely changes the shooting experience. When I turn the camera on, there's no menu waiting for me, no settings to check. I simply start taking photographs. Focus, aperture, exposure compensation. Those three controls make about 97% of everything I do with this camera. And I absolutely love that. I also love being able to choose between 18, 36 and 60 megapixels. For my personal photography, I almost always shoot at 18 megapixel. That's still more than enough for prints up to a meter wide, while giving me some room to crop when I need it. Speaking of enjoyment, that brings me to what I think is the most important part of this camera, the way it feels to use. The M11-P doesn't have many buttons or dials, but every single one feels incredibly well made. There's no play, every button has a crisp, confident click. Even the shutter speed dial has this wonderfully mechanical feel every time you turn it. The only control I'm not completely sold on is the ISO dial. Having to lift it before you can rotate, it feels unnecessarily stiff to me. The camera itself is absolutely beautiful. To my eyes, the understated black finish of the M11-P paired with a silver lens and shutter button is simply gorgeous. But Leica's iconic design also comes with something I hadn't really considered before. People instantly recognize it. Whether there's a red dot on the camera or not, they know it's a Leica. And with that recognition comes a whole set of assumptions about the person standing behind it. Fortunately, none of that changes how enjoyable it is to carry. Even without an additional grip, it sits comfortably in my hand. And even more importantly, it's incredibly comfortable to wear all day. Nothing pokes into my side, nothing gets in the way. It's simply a camera that I always want to have with me. Compared to both my Hasselblad X2D and the 907X, the Leica is noticeably smaller and lighter, and makes for a beautiful everyday carry. I honestly think this is a camera I would still be using 20 years from now. One of the biggest strengths of the Leica M system is its incredible selection of lenses. Although I focus my workshops on photography with Hasselblad cameras, the conversation about Leica lenses never gets old. Yes, Bernd and Michael, I'm talking about you. I've listened to endless discussions comparing Summicrons to Summilux lenses, version 2s versus version 3s, steel rim versus sphericals. And I get it. Leica and third-party companies like Voigtlander, Zeiss and Typok offer an almost endless ecosystem of lenses. Compared to Hasselblad, there's always another lens to discover, another character, another rendering, another finish. Black, silver, safari. I honestly think that's part of what makes Leica so addictive. I started my Leica journey with the 35mm Summilux steel rim. And well, I have to admit, I was really underwhelmed. At well over 4,000 euro, it's priced similarly to a Hasselblad V lens. But unlike the Hasselblad, there's no autofocus, no medium format coverage, and to my surprise, not even exceptional build quality or sharpness at wide apertures. Between f1.4 and f2.5, the edges become almost unusable soft. The aperture ring feels rough, and the 1 meter minimum focus distance is simply too limiting for the kind of family photography I enjoy with this setup. At least for me, this particular Leica lens didn't live up to the expectations I had. Right now, I'm testing the Typok 35mm f2 Xana and the 75mm f1.4 C-Mirror. Not just on the Leica M11-P, but also on my Hasselblad cameras. Typok claims its lenses cover the full medium format sensor, so I'm really curious to see how they perform on both systems. If you don't want to miss that comparison, I'd really appreciate if you give this video a like and subscribe to the channel now. Before I wrap this up, one quick note. This video isn't sponsored. While I have an ongoing professional relationship with Hasselblad, every opinion in this video comes from my own experience after several months of living with both systems. If you found solutions to some of the issues I mentioned, I'd genuinely love to hear them in the comments. I know I've been pretty critical about the Leica M11-P throughout this video, and honestly, that surprised me more than anyone else. Years of YouTube videos, marketing, and the almost mythical reputation of Leica had created a certain expectation in my mind. Things like USB-C charging, the internal storage, and image quality were all major reasons I chose the M11-P over the M10. Would I still choose my Hasselblad if image quality were the only thing that mattered? Absolutely. To my eyes, Hasselblad still delivers the most natural colors and the most consistent files I've ever worked with. But that's no longer the only question I'm asking. The Hasselblad X2D Mark II is the camera I reach for when I need absolute reliability. Solid autofocus, IBIS, 100 megapixel. It's the camera I trust when there's no room for mistakes. The 907X has different strengths. It's a compact, medium format powerhouse and can be transformed into a technical camera whenever I need movements and precision. And the Leica M11-P, it has reminded me why I fell in love with photography in the first place. Not because it's technically perfect, but because it strips photography down to its pure essentials: composition, focus, exposure. Nothing more. It's a camera that's just with me, and the one that reminds me to stop chasing perfection and simply enjoy making photographs. I hope this video gave you a different perspective on Leica's most iconic camera. Not through the eye of a lifelong Leica photographer, but through the eyes of someone who learned to appreciate beautiful craftsmanship in camera manufacturing. If you have questions, or if you have discovered solutions to some of the things I struggled with, I'd love to continue the conversation in the comments. Until next time, as always, have fun shooting.